In an interview last week on PBS, the defense chief, Robert Gates, was asked how many American troops he thought might still be in Iraq 3+ years from now. Remember, the Status of Forces agreement just signed by Bush and the Iraqi government says that U.S. troops will be gone from Iraq entirely in 3 years. Nevertheless, Bob Gates said he thought there would be a residual force of U.S. troops in Iraq more than 3 years from now that numbered in the several tens of thousands. Several tens of thousands of U.S. troops indefinitely staying in Iraq, even beyond the country-to-country agreement we just signed with Iraq that says we'll leave? Boy, you know, if you are one of the 70% of Americans who wants U.S. troops out of Iraq on that 16-month timetable that Obama promised, I bet you are glad about this election we just had, huh? Getting rid of that old administration that sees several tens of thousands of American troops indefinitely in Iraq for years. Wow, good thing we are saying goodbye to George W. Bush's Defense Secretary, Bob Gates. And now we're saying hello to Barack Obama's Defense Secretary, Bob Gates. The Gates pronouncement about residual forces last week was followed by a report in the New York Times today that the U.S. may try to get around the just signed requirement that U.S. combat troops be out of Iraqi cities by June of next year by massaging the meaning of the word combat. You ready? Quote, military planners are now quietly acknowledging that many troops will stay behind as renamed trainers and advisors in what are effectively combat roles. In other words, they will still be engaged in combat, just called something else. So, Iraq withdrawal? Not really a withdrawal. And as for Afghanistan, well, there's not even a semantic pretense of withdrawal plans there. A massive U.S. troop buildup is in the works, according to the Associated Press today. Quote, all told, the U.S. could nearly double its troop levels there to as many as 60,000, sending up to 4 combat brigades and thousands of support forces within the next year. So let's recap here. Not withdrawal in Iraq, potentially doubling forces in Afghanistan. Oh, and there's also that escalating as yet undeclared war in Pakistan, where officials claim another U.S. drone killed at least 7 people today. Okay, so here's my worry. Didn't Osama bin Laden say that his plan was to bleed America to the point of bankruptcy? Aren't occupied Muslim countries sort of their best recruiting tactic ever? And didn't the bleed until bankruptcy plan kind of work against the Soviet Union in Afghanistan, bog them down indefinitely, like we seem to be in Iraq and Afghanistan? Yeah, I need to be talked down here. Joining us now is Lawrence Wright, staff writer for The New Yorker magazine and author of the Pulitzer Prize-winning and very, very important book, The Looming Tower, Al-Qaeda and the Road to 9/11. Mr. Wright, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Well, thank you, Rachel. It's great to be here.
What was bin Laden talking about when he talked about this bleed until bankruptcy strategy?
Well, that's part of his idea, is that we attack America economically as well as militarily in a terrorist fashion. All these are different parts of the terrorist agenda, and one of the ideas he had was to draw us into Afghanistan, just as the Soviet Union had gone in. And you remember in 1979 when the Soviets went in, they stayed there 10 years, they lost 50,000 troops, and when they left, what happened? The Soviet Union disintegrated, it fell apart. It was in bin Laden's mind the same thing would happen to the United States. It would actually become the disunited States.
There's a little mini trend happening right now in national security journalism of Western reporters seeking out Russian generals from that era of the Soviet occupation of Afghanistan and saying, how many of the mistakes that you guys made are the Americans making now? And the answers are always exactly what you don't want to hear. Is there any reason to believe that the U.S. military presence in Afghanistan is smarter, better, has a better end game than the Russians had?
At this point, you can't say that. Unfortunately, we don't have a clear strategy in Afghanistan. Our goals are really muddy and have been since we went in. I mean, we went in 7 years ago, 8 years ago. In a matter of a few weeks, we demolished the Taliban, swept aside the Al-Qaeda. Both of those entities were essentially destroyed. The war on terror was over 8 years ago. And that was the state of affairs when we invaded Iraq. And it was that war, unfortunately, that allowed these embers to burst back into flame.
It seems like one of the complicated strategic issues about fighting terrorism and using the military to do so is that we really assume that having a safe haven, having friendly territory in which to operate is absolutely key to the success of figures like bin Laden and groups like Al-Qaeda. Have you found that to be the case in your study of Al-Qaeda, that they need friendly territory, they need geographic room to move?
Really, it's true. I mean, they operate very well on the internet. They form informal alliances like that, but there's no substitute for actually having sanctuaries. And that was where they were free to train and form these networks and raise money, generate the kind of military planning that really distinguished Al-Qaeda before 9/11. And it's important to keep those sanctuaries eliminated.
In terms of the thinking about how far is too far and when you start having diminishing returns with a military presence, is there reason to believe that an extended, indefinite, long-term U.S. military presence in Afghanistan and in Iraq would be something that Al-Qaeda would see as to their advantage?
Oh yeah, I think that there's no question that Al-Qaeda sees this as a rallying point, both of these countries, for recruits. And unfortunately, from their point of view, Iraq hasn't turned out so well. But they're migrating now into Afghanistan and into the tribal areas of Pakistan, and we're following them there.
Lawrence Wright, author of The Looming Tower, thank you so much for joining us tonight.
It was a pleasure, Rachel. Thank you.
If this were a dictatorship, it'd be a heck of a lot easier. Just so long as I'm the dictator.